Hey, Tony. Welcome to the podcast. First question. What do you think the appeal is of the show to make it so successful?
You can go anywhere, anytime. If you look at Star Wars, that's set when it is. If you look at the Marvel Cinematic Universe, even though that goes across all sorts of things, there are finite boundaries. But with Doctor Who, you can just do anything and do any story you want, basically, and that's what they do. Ultimately, it's gone on for 60 years because of the Daleks, because they appeared in the 5th episode in the second story at the end of December 1963, and it just caught a nation's imagination. And it's had its ups and downs, but from then on in, yeah, it's just a great format. And the guy who came up with it, first of all, a Canadian gentleman called Sidney Newman, who the BBC had hired from ITV in the early 1960s, he can take a lot of the credit, really. Along with the first producer, Verity Lambert, who was only 26, I think, when she took over, the first female producer in Doctor Who in television. So again, it breaks boundaries. It's always broken boundaries.
How important is it to have decent villains in the Doctor Who universe?
Absolutely essential, but you have to balance. You need to balance between old villains, shall we say, and more modern ones. There's been attempts over the decades to try and replicate the success of, say, the Daleks in the late 60s. There were little robot things called the Quarks that were introduced, and it was hoped that they would become a merchandise success, and they crashed and burned, and it didn't happen. Since it came back in 2005, most of the classic villains have returned. But you've got your modern ones. In particular, everyone thinks of the Weeping Angels, which have been a humongous success. And you had villains called the Silent. Every goodie has to have a baddie to fight. And so Sherlock Holmes had his Moriarty, and in 1971, Terence Dicks, the script editor, came up with the idea of Master, who was the Moriarty to John Pertwee's Doctor in that thing. And the Master has returned over time, and was last seen in the last episode that we've seen, Power of the Doctor, played by Sacha Dhawan. He's the latest person to play him. But you've had top quality actors playing the Master like John Sim, Derek Jacobi in modern days, Michelle Gomez. So, yeah, good guys, bad guys. That's what all stories are about, isn't it? Oh, action stories, anyhow.
Do you think a part of the appeal of Doctor Who is the fact it is slightly scary, especially if you're watching it as a child, and that's what draws you in? The fact that it is a little bit dark in places.
Yeah, I mean, the Daleks terrified me when I was a kid, and it's quite, and the Weeping Angels certainly have done the same to children. And it's quite right too. And the great thing about, again, with Doctor Who, you can have light and shade. So you can have some episodes which are slightly more comedic, should we say. They're not played for comedy. And you have episodes like Peter Capaldi's final two-parter, which involved the Cybermen, the original Cybermen, whatever. That was so dark and incredibly gloomy. And going back, when David Tennant left, he did 4 specials in that final year. And the second of the specials was called The Waters of Mars. And it was the most depressing thing you've ever. But it was brilliant, absolutely superb. But it was unremitted. It was light for the first 5 minutes, and then it was absolutely. I loved it. It's a story I do go back to because it's just so good to rewatch.
In terms of the origins of the Doctor, is there a lot we don't know? I mean, we don't know his name. Is that ever revealed in any episodes, or is that unnecessary?
It's unnecessary. There's been numerous stories where it's been hinted at, and to be fair, his background has sort of been tinkered with on many occasions, including recently in the last 2 or 3 years by Chris Chibnall. So we'll have to see. But no, we don't need to know his name, do we?
It kind of, I suppose, that is the appeal, isn't it? The mystery, that you don't need to know everything about a character to love the character and to want to watch the character and what they do.
Yeah, and I say different people, showrunners have different takes on it. Ultimately, he's the Doctor. We don't know his name, and I don't think we need to.
In terms of, we talked about the villains, the companions, and the Doctors. Who are your favourites? Do you have a top list?
Well, yeah, there's a sort of theory that your favourite Doctor is the first one you saw, but that's not the case for me because I started watching it as a little kid when it started in 1963. My favourite Doctor of all time is Tom Baker. He was the longest running, and he was just magnificent in the role. I'm also a big fan of Patrick Troughton, who was the second Doctor. Since the show came back, I loved Christopher Eccleston, and I wish we had got more than one series from him.
And what about villains? You talked about the Weeping Angels and the Daleks.
I think the danger with the Daleks in more recent Who is that they've been overused. They would back in the 70s, say, they appeared in 3-4 consecutive years, but then they had a gap of 4 years, and after that they had a gap from 79 until 84. I think it's a bit of a shame you see them in every season. It just reduces their impact, I think. And I think the same goes for the Cybermen, who weren't after 1968. They were seen in a story in 75, and from after that they weren't seen until 1982. That really works. So I like the Zygons, I like the Ice Warriors. There was a brilliant monster. It was only a one-off in what's probably my favourite story ever, which was called The Seeds of Doom, which was a Tom Baker story. And there was it was very much like The Thing from outer space, where it was a pod that was discovered in the Antarctic permafrost, and it was brought back to a country house where this mad Englishman got it, and it grew into this 40, 50 foot tall plant called the crinoid, and I absolutely adore it. What a great concept it is. It's one of my favourites.
Talking about baddies, I think it kind of gave me nightmares. The Candyman. I don't know if you remember that baddie. And you look at
that was well, it was controversial at the time because obviously it was a take on Bertie Bassett, wasn't it? It was in a story called The Happiness Patrol, which is a very good story because it was a riff on Thatcher's Britain, and it was only decades later that actually that got into the news and things. You've got to remember that something like in that story you're talking about, that was purely shot in studio at TV Centre in Shepherd's Bush. So it was restricted for that. The budgets were very low, and it's a good story. And the Candyman was a sort of the monster of the week, but actually the villain was played by villainess was played by Sheila Hancock. She was the real bad person in it.
I don't think it really matters the kind of production values of the special effects, because I think what matters is the scripts and the characters and the relationships between them. You talk about Tom Baker and some of the newer Doctors, and you look at them. I mean, these are really high caliber actors, like you mentioned, Chris Eccleston, and I think that has really helped keep the series alive and fresh.
The script is the key.
Yeah,
it's without a good, and throughout all of Doctor Who, there have been good scripts and there have been bad scripts.
Yeah,
there have been real peaks like mid-70s Tom Baker, and there have been troughs. And it's the same for any program, any franchise. You look at the Star Wars movies; some have been good, but some have not been very good, have they? What did happen back in the day, actors who played the Doctor in the classic era were concerned that they would get typecast, apart from Tom Baker, who would have played it forever. But nowadays, it's someone like David Tennant. He was just breaking. He'd done Casanova, whatever. It was perfect timing for him, and his career has just gone on and on. Obviously, the person who's probably made the biggest of companions has made the biggest career is probably Karen Gillan, who has become huge in America in Guardians of the Galaxy and the Jumanji films. Her career has just boomed. I mean, it's incredible.
The other thing I read, and it was fascinating, is that Doctor Who is the most successful sci-fi series of all time anywhere. When you look at all the different manifestations of Doctor Who in terms of books and comics and TV series, are you surprised at how successful it's been in the UK and all over the world?
First of all, I have to say Trekkies would disagree with what you said, but I'm not going to. Am I surprised? No. The BBC has never actually had a huge amount of faith in the programme. That's why they really drove it into the ground in the 1980s, and then they just let it sort of die. Came back in 1996 with the TV movie with Paul McGann that was filmed in Vancouver. And it was Russell T Davies and Jane Tranter and Julie Gardner, who brought it back in 2005. And I know Russell has said that they wanted to do it, and by the time some of the higher ups at the BBC realised what was going on, it was too late to stop it because too much had been invested in it already. But I don't think the BBC necessarily know what to do with it. And the interesting thing for now is that The Power of the Doctor was the last episode to be made by the BBC. This, when Tennant comes in November and then Gatwa, this is being made by Bad Wolf Studios, not by BBC Studios. That's the company that was set up 8 years ago by Jane Tranter and Julie Gardner, the self-same people who were executive producers on Doctor Who when it came back in 2005. And they've got Russell T Davies on board, and he's executive producing and show running. And Phil Collinson, who was the producer from 2005, he's back, and he produced Coronation Street for several years after. And this is actually a brand new. There was the classic Who from 63 to 89. There was a TV movie, and there's been new Who from 2005 until last year. This is not new Who moving forward. I'm calling it Neo Who because it is made by Bad Wolf Studios. The BBC are showing it in the UK and Ireland. But Bad Wolf Studios, a majority shareholder nowadays, is Sony Pictures. And obviously Disney Plus has got a big involvement, and they're going to be broadcasting it globally. There's a huge amount of money going into it. I'm expecting effects on the scale of the likes of The Mandalorian and that sort of thing. So I actually think that Doctor Who is going to become bigger than ever. When we get to October, beginning of November, there is going to be them. You won't be able to move or breathe without hearing or seeing Doctor Who. And then, so there'll be 3 episodes then, specials, then there'll be probably Christmas Day with Gatwa. There'll be the first series next year. They're going to start filming his second series in October. And then we're going to have the spin-offs. Because when it came back, Russell T Davies did Torchwood, Sarah Jane Adventures. There are going to be spin-offs as well. So in my opinion, it's going to be bigger than ever before.
Why do you think the BBC had this really negative attitude to Doctor Who? Because really, it's unique in terms of their channel content. There's nothing quite like it anywhere in the world, really. And it's been so successful. It just seems counterintuitive why they tried to can it or mothball it in the late 80s.
Because they don't know they've never had the greatest idea of what to do with it. They've had this hit that they didn't realise. And they just there's a distrust, I think, that's come through it. The unfortunate thing is the people who've been running the programme since it came back, and in particular, I'll talk about Russell T Davies and Stephen Moffat, are the 2 most important television writers and showrunners that this country has had for the last 30 years. And through their sheer force of personality and insistence, they've taken it here, there, and everywhere. They are the 2 biggest talents in this country, and they've both gone off and done their own things. So remember, Moffat was doing Sherlock at the same time as Doctor Who, and Davis gave us Torchwood, Sarah Jane, then he gave up, but he's gone away and done all the things he wanted to do. Now I can go back to my favourites, because they both love it. They grew up watching it. So now I can go back and do Doctor Who again, which makes me happy. And that's it. Most of the people involved in the organisation of it since it came back in professionally and this, that, and the other, they were Doctor Who fans. They grew up watching it. They're of my generation. Most of them are a little bit younger than me, but only by a year or 2. And they've been writing for it. They've been doing the books. They've been doing the comics. They've been all sorts of things. And there you go. It's great. I hope the next generation have started watching it from Russell T Davies, and they're going to grow up doing it, so it keeps going.
Yeah, it is fascinating. It just seemed like we're on the precipice of a very exciting time for Doctor Who in terms of, like you say, Disney taking over some of the production and throwing more money at it to make it like The Mandalorian in terms of the effects and really showcasing what Doctor Who's capable of.
Yeah, but at the same time, it's being made in Cardiff still, but in Bad Wolf Studios, and it's being made by people who have a passion for the programme, and that's essential.
Tony, that's been brilliant talking to you. I know it's been very brief.
We've barely scratched the surface, Tony. Thanks a lot, Tony.
Bye-bye.
Cheers.